Hi everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from our Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Whaling Station. This is a story about a man and a business that once added much to Grays Harbor. They're both gone now, but they left plenty of stories to remind us of them. They were once an important part of Grays Harbor's varied life. Some of you will remember the business. Some of you will recall the man who built it, and who lived here as a Grays Harbor resident long after the business he started had disappeared. There'll be some of you to whom this story is the first factual tale you have heard of what has long been just a legend. The story actually starts in St. John, New Brunswick, for it was that far-off city that the principal was born. His name was Victor H. Street. Do you remember Vic? He was Vic to the whole harbor. Vic Street, at an early age, got himself mixed up with the whaling industry. He took a job down at Boston with Harvey and Altbridge, a young whale processing company, and soon building his first whaling station at St. John's, Newfoundland. In the years that followed, he scattered whaling stations along the East Coast, and in doing so became one of the best informed men in that rather restricted work. Vic did his job well. He was blunt, to the point, and while it made him something of a character, it also made him many enemies. And it got action. As one old-timer said about Vic Street, I always knew exactly how I stood with him. Anyhow, Vic's tactics pleased the company. When he promised to do a job in 10 days, it took exactly that time. When he agreed to do something and get it done, it was done. When Harvey and Altbridge took to the west for new whaling areas, it was Vic Street that they sent west to develop them. He went to Murder Cove, Alaska to establish the Thai Whaling Company that would be on Branoff Island, and it was the first whaling station constructed in what is now one of the last big whaling grounds of the world. Into the Thai station, Vic Street put the experience of building 11 other processing plants, and it was the pride of the company. When it was in operation, its efficiency and operating innovations made it the talk of the far north. For a couple of years, Vic operated the Thai plant and got acquainted with Eskimos in the tundra, and then one day a letter from his firm's Boston office brought word of his next assignment. With the Thai running wells through on schedule, Harvey and Alterbridge were ready to send their advanced man to another area. Vic read the letter carefully, then went to the wall of his office and scanned the map of the United States. He followed up the coast from San Francisco to the Strait of Juan de Fuca, then came back down the Washington shorelines hundreds of miles. There it was. There was the name the letter mentioned, Grays Harbor on the Washington coast. Vic Street began to pack his bags and asked his friends what they knew about the harbor on the Washington coast, midway between the Columbia River and the Puget Sound. As was his way, he began to store up a vast fund of information on the new country he was about to see. Vic Street came to Grays Harbor, bringing with him a fund of knowledge about whaling, whale processing plant building, and a lot of other things. In fact, the late Lance Hart once quoted as saying, Vic had the most amazing fund of useless knowledge of anyone he knew. If that was so, he had also one of the most amazing funds of useful knowledge. Vic registered at the Washington Hotel and began to scout over the harbor for a proper place for a whaling station. He tried the north side and the south side. He worked his way down the south side of the harbor toward South Bay. When he picked his location, it was the best bathing beach inside the harbor, the beach that had been a resort for thousands of harborites ever since the railroad had pushed its lines to the edge of the South Bay. While swimmers moaned over the loss of their beach, the industrial-minded rejoiced over the new industry and predicted that Grays Harbor would soon be the whaling capital of the world, the Bedford of the West. Grays Harbor has always had its prophets who would make it into a New York City overnight. In any event, Vic sent to work to build a new plant. It was early 1911 when he started to punch down the piles for the whaling station. Building almost mechanically, as he had the 12 others behind him, Vic threw the station up in no time. By the 1st of June, the first whale was on the float ready for stripping. The steamer Patterson, some of you will remember that little vessel, was already on its way back out to sea to bring in its next catch. When the workmen swarmed over the carcass, slicing and hacking, the boilers were steamed up and great vats began to bubble and fry and render the blubber. The afternoon breeze that afternoon brought the fragrance heretofore unknown to Grays Harbor. It was eau-de-well brisket, unmistakably, and once you had caught it on the wind, you never forgot it. In the months that followed, the whole South Bay area took on the strength of that breeze. It didn't keep Grays Harbor folks from satisfying their curiosity either as to what a whale looked like or what it smelt like at close range. Every Sunday saw a trainload of holiday goers getting off the train at Bay City to inspect the whaling plant, and many of them made a stop at the station, a side trip on their way to Westport. During the early 18-teens, Grays Harbor was gaining a name as a whaling port. The whaling station grew and prospered. The industry never reached the proportions of New Bedford's better days, but before it had been in operation 2 years, the steamer Patterson was joined by the Morin, the Aberdeen, and the Westport. From the California coast to the Aleutian Islands, Grays Harbor whalers were scanning the Pacific for their big game. The local harpoon gunners were accurate and sure. From 200 to 300 whales were floated into the harbor each year behind the little steamer to be rendered down in the whaling plant at Bay City. The settlement at South Bay flourished because of this, and when the long bridge was built to connect it to Westport and a reasonable road built to the beach, it was a favorite drive for the early motorist. Vic Street, who started it all by building the station, was a believer in comfort, and after he had his whaling station in operation, he built the most important unit of the plant, the manager's house. It was big, twin-gabled dwelling standing right on the edge of the bluff where its owner could scan the harbor bar for the first sign of the whalers returning with their catch. Its glassed front looked out to sea on bright days, and when the storms lashed the coast, it caught the winds and the driving rain head on. It stands there today. In the years before World War I, Vic Street and the whaling station became an important part of Grays Harbor's growing interest. Tourists coming to out of their way parts of the world would invariably search out the whaling station and have their pictures taken standing beside or on top of or near as that particular well would permit them to stand. It was a common thing for a group of dignitaries to make the trip down to the harbor to inspect the plant and to predict big things for the whaling industry. But the whaling industry of the Northwest, which is what the plant represented, was enjoying as big time as it would ever know. With the 4 whalers operating out of the port, bringing in their catch up to 300 whales a year, this part of the world was losing its whale population rapidly. By the time the Kaisers got in trouble, production was beginning to slow. 150 whales a year was a big year now. But the war provided a new market for the beast of the sea. When beef was scarce or pork scarcer, someone suggested that we eat whale meat. You see, in processing the oil, only the blubber and certain selected portions of the big deep-water animal were utilized. The rest went into fertilizer products, with a few of the large bones going to friends of the management to make artistic arches over their driveways. The idea was better than its originator thought. They cut a few steaks from choice parts of the whale and fried them well. A brave volunteer tried it. It was good. It tasted, he said, like beef, maybe better. That month, Grays Harbor's meat market began to sell whale steaks. Do you remember those? Back in 1918 or 1919? When the war was over, the whaling industry on Grays Harbor was about done. Vic Street had registered his post to go with another whaling firm that proposed to build a station in San Francisco. But after a number of passes at the project, the company abandoned its venture and Vic went into business for himself in Aberdeen. In the early 1920s, the station at Bay City was shut down, and soon afterwards, the plant crew, the ships, and the machinery were moved to Kodiak Island off Alaska, where Harvey and Altbridge built their new plant. The whaling industry abandoned Grays Harbor, probably forever, and moved north for what may be the last stand of this vanishing trade, whale hunting and processing. The man who brought whaling to the harbor stayed on after it had moved north. He stayed on to build a home and raise a family and become one of the true individualists of our hometown. As I said earlier in this yarn, Vic Street, the whaler, was a man of action. He was blunt, to the point, but those who learned to know him found that under his gruffness and directness there was an infinite capacity for human appreciation and understanding. Vic loved people in a fierce, righteous, unpossessing way. He wanted them to do fine things and to live with color and yet with dignity. And above all, he loved a story. Few who knew him failed to hear some of the vast funds of stories told in delicate and the vernacular of the people, as the ones that he liked to tell best were of whaling men and whaling days, an era of high adventure that for him ended here on Grays Harbor. And another chapter in our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.